Hello, world history. We are on to our next lecture. We have been talking about, um, first of all, the expansion of Western European nations, right, seeking trade routes to Asia, the bumping into of the Americas by Columbus for Spain, the establishment of a Spanish empire in the Americas and in parts of Asia like the Philippines. We've also talked about religion and how religion played a role in all of this, both positively and negatively, and how religion was changed. Christianity was our main focus. We also touched on changes in Islam, in Buddhism, in China with Confucianism and Buddhism and Taoism, and Hinduism, a little bit in India. So there's a lot of changes going on. Today we're going to look at what we consider to be two of the major, there are a couple others, of the major land-based empires that dominate this period of what we call the early modern world, about 1450 to about 1750. And those two empires are the emerging Russian Empire, a European empire, but again, a Eastern European empire, and significantly what we call a land-based empire, and the Chinese Empire. So let's go ahead and take a look at these. We're going to start with Russia. So if we recall back a while ago, the last time we talked about Russia, we talked about how the Mongols came in, kind of took over Russia, established Russia as one of their territories that they controlled. It was part of the Mongolian Empire. And for the most part, all the Mongols did was they just made the Russian small princes pay some tribute to them a few times a year. Basically, some taxes, they'd come and collect their taxes. And if they didn't do that, then they'd bring, the Mongols would come with their army and take it from them. We talked about how that system eventually began to fall apart and how a new Russian state that unified Russia developed around Kiev, right? With Kiev also being the center of government for the Mongols. And so they kind of gained their independence. One of the things as they gained independence is they wanted to move further away from the threat of the Mongols and other nomadic tribes from Central Asia as they moved their capital a little further west to Moscow. And so where we're picking up the story now, the center of the Russian state is now in the city of Moscow. Having gained, right, secured their independence, their freedom from the Mongols, they began conquering a number of neighboring Russian-speaking cities. Okay. And so this is the beginning of an empire, of a Russian empire, of a fairly unified ethnocentric empire, at least at the beginning, taking over these neighboring Russian-speaking cities. Expansion continued, particularly to the south and east of Moscow. And as they expanded, in particular south and then east, right now starting to push back into Central Asia a little bit, into the Siberian plains and so on, they began encountering other cultures, other people, other languages, and they began bringing them into under their control. And again, when we define empires during this period of time, we're talking about a government with a defined boundaries, right, territory, and a government that rules over different ethnicities and races, cultures, peoples, right? They bring them under control. And so that's what we're going to be looking at here. And these two, the Russian Empire and the Chinese Empire, or the Manchurian Empire, are excellent examples that meet this definition. Notice all the European empires do meet that definition as well, right? Spaniards ruling over, for instance, the Filipinos and various Native American groups in the Americas. Spain, same with England, right? Gaining control of parts of North America and Native Americans there, and other places. Portugal, right? not the territorial part, not so good, but certainly control over different people. And that's an important element of our definition of empire, particularly in the early modern and modern world. So here we can see, right, a map. So Kiev, sorry, I said Moscow Moscow is actually to the north. And we got to remember that when we look at this map, since we're looking at a globe, right, we have, if we were to look at maps, our longitudinal lines, right, go kind of like this. I hope that makes sense. So the distance between, for instance, Novograd and Moscow, right, is actually about the same as between Kiev and Moscow. And because we're looking, this is actually a ball. So don't let the fact that we're looking at the top of the earth, right, confuse us too much. We're looking at a ball. But I did misspeak. So Moscow is actually more north of Kiev and slightly east of Kiev. That's my mistake on the previous slide. But we can see, right, Moscow's here, so this is the center, and we can see that Muscovy in 1462, right, the power of the city, the king prince who ruled this area, Moscow, and its territory is in purple there, and over the next couple hundred years, it slowly grows, and then they begin to expand out into this green area, and then they take over this kind of orange area. So far, most of that green area, primarily Russian-speaking people, the orange area, a variation of Russian, so very similar language. Excuse me. And it isn't until they start expanding, for instance, past the Ural Mountains here into Siberia, that they start to truly encounter different languages and different cultures. And to some degree, here to the north of the Caspian Sea, there's going to be some significant differences there. And as they expand a little bit more west, they start to get into what we consider more Central Europe. And again, some different languages. Right, but this is the expanse of Russia. And we can see even here, by 1644, right, this is about the time that that Jamestown here in the United States has up and running and is going to survive and last, right? We can see that Russia has expanded, or is expanding here into the wilds of Siberia, and they actually have control here, very close to Japan and north of China and Korea. The other thing we should say is there are some similarities, which we will touch on here in a moment, that as Russia expands west, this is kind of like how America as Russia expands east. The experiences has some similarities to American expansion west. All right, let's continue. So why? Why are Russians interested in expanding? Motivation number one, security from the nomadic pastorals peoples, right? They had been under the power of the Mongols for a while, and so by expanding, they're creating kind of a buffer zone from any of that happening again. Right, these pastoral peoples lived on the grasslands south and east of the Russian heartland. So those areas where I said where non-Russian speaking people were living. And Russians were afraid that one of these groups will rise to power like the Mongols had. And so the best way to do that is go ahead and control that territory and control the people there to prevent them from rising to power like the Mongols had. In addition, the nomads in the nomadic tradition, like the Mongols, they frequently raided Russia's neighbors and sold many of them into slavery and took other things. So this expansion is, right, one motivation is security, to be secure and create a buffer zone and or control the people that pose potential threat to Russia. Number two, there's another economic reason, and that is to get the pelts of fur-bearing animals. right? Pelts, we're just talking about the furs or the skin and fur together of these fur-bearing animals. And so trappers, Russian trappers would go east into the expanse of Siberia, and they would find these furs that would get that would demand high prices on in particularly in the European markets, right? For hats, for royalty dress, things like this. And so this is a natural resource that's going to be exploited and hunted. Again, very valuable, in-demand item. People pay a lot of money in Europe for articles that are made out of fur. And this generated a nickname of soft gold because it was relatively easy to get and it was worth a lot of money, particularly if you got certain animals, which were plentiful, at least at the beginning, in Siberia. So expansion, particularly now to the east, not only helps them deal with nomadic tribes who had been threats to them, it also opens up the ability to hunt for these fur-bearing animals. So for Russians, those are the two main motivations, right? And if we add a couple other little pieces to this, we can see that for the Russians, for them, their empire meant defending the Russian frontiers. That's that security aspect and a little bit of the economic, right? Defending and protecting the economic access to those furs. It also means enhancing the power of the Russian state, right? This is a state building exercise. And just as Spain and Portugal and France and England go through state building exercises that we've already looked at, and as they expand around the world, Russia is also looking to expand around the world. Now, Russia has a problem. Russia really doesn't have great access to the oceans like Spain, France, and England has. So Russia does have all this land, particularly to the east. And so they see their empire building and their expansion and consolidation of power as a land, and this is why it's a land-based empire, as a land, right, by gaining land and adding it to their territory. And they don't necessarily need a navy to do that or ships to do that. So they just expand, right? And this enhances the power of the Russian state. Right, and lastly, similar to Western Europeans, they are motivated to bring Christianity, civilization, and enlightenment to the savages. And those savages are going to be those nomadic peoples living in Siberia and in Central Asia that they end up conquering. So many of these motivations are similar to the other motivations we saw of other Europeans. What was life like in the Russian Empire? Well, everyone had to swear an oath of allegiance to the Grand Tsar, which is basically the king. The term czar actually comes from Roman times, a variation of Caesar. And this is started as, right, the most powerful prince in the area, and eventually becomes for us, basically, it just means king. Everyone had to pay a yasak or a tribute, right, in cash or valuable goods to the Grand Tsar. So that tribute system still remains. We can think of it both in terms of feudal, right, system where they owe goods to their lord, and we can also think of it as the Mongols used it, just simply a tribute. You got to pay this tax, otherwise bad things may happen. As Russia expanded, particularly into the east, right, they brought disease, just like Europeans brought disease to the Americas. They brought diseases to an area that had not experienced many of these diseases, at least to the extent before expansion. Now, the impact was not nearly as devastating as it was in the Americas, because certainly the nomads of Central Asia had been in contact with Europeans. They had had some contact with smallpox and measles, etc. But it still brought a new exposure to these, and it had an impact. And so it did, right, reduce the population, which makes it more difficult to resist Russian expansion. People also felt the pressure to convert to Christianity, particularly if you're in one of those areas then that you're not Christian, right? And Russia's expanded into where you're living. There was extreme pressure to convert to Christianity. Some of the traditional ways that we've already seen, right, pressure to convert to the religion of the power of the state, things like tax breaks. So you got taxed less if you were a Christian. You didn't have to pay some tributes, or right, or the Yasek, or versions, or a portion of the Yasek to the Grand Tsar. You could be given land and own land potentially if you converted to Christianity. If you remained a, quote, savage, then you couldn't own that land anymore. The Russian state had taken it, and you could no longer own it, land that had been yours. We take these things and we take a man like Ivan the Terrible, who was probably a pretty terrible man, someone who believed in his absolute authority and rule, who believed in violence, in torture, in pretty much do anything to secure and keep his power and expand the Russian state. Notice he did rule for quite a while, about 50 years. A harsh man, a harsh man. And so when we take some of these things like tribute, right, fear of what happens when you don't pay tribute, disease, pressure to convert to Christianity, right, he embodies those. And makes it a little bit fearful. Of course, if you're on his good side, everything's great, but you don't want to be on his bad side. So this results in a huge influx of Russian settlers to the conquered territories within the empire, and they begin to outnumber the native peoples. I mentioned earlier, right, that we're going to see that there's some similarities if we're familiar with American history, U.S. history, right, that this also happens in the American West. A lot of American settlers move west into the Great Plains and then eventually into places like here, like California and Oregon and Washington. Russian settlers do the same, and they settle throughout Siberia and that large territory to the east of Moscow. So by 1720, the population of Siberia was about 70% Russian, right, descendants of Russian settlers, and about 30% native Siberians. A significant transformation. Those who did remain, those natives who did remain, right, ended up generally becoming Russified. And this is a term that we may come across from time to time. That means that they adopted the Russian language and culture, they converted to Christianity, gave up their traditional hunting and gathering lifestyle, etc. They assimilated into Russian culture. Of course, there's going to be some things that they kept, but in this case, in general, right, we would say that they became Russian. Although they may not ethnically be Russian, they became Russian. They dressed Russian. They spoke Russian. They practiced Russian cultures, including Christianity. And this would be Eastern Orthodox Christianity, not Roman Catholicism. Right, and they gave up much of their previous lifestyle. The land is transformed as Russians move and expand their empire, right? What used to be hunting grounds and pasture lands for their horses and herds of cattle or sheep or whatever now become farmland. Agricultural settlers come, farmers come, they plow up that land, they cut down the forests, and they change it, they turn it into farms, particularly growing things like wheat and barley. And these come under the control of Russian agricultural settlers and farmers, or at least princes who hire, right, who hire or otherwise force laborers to work their agricultural farms. This means that native peoples become dependent on Russian markets for crops and luxury goods, right? So as for these native nomads, as their hunting grounds are taken away, as their pasture lands are taken away and turned into farms, now where they got their resources to live, like where they got their food, their basic resources for making clothes and shelters and so on, that's been now taken away, right? Not only do they not have access to it, it has literally been removed, and right, what used to be pasture lands where they could graze their horses, etc., no longer exist. And so this forces them to enter into Russian markets to get these things. So now instead of going out and hunting, they have to go to a Russian market and purchase meat instead of gathering up what is kind of naturally out there for other food products. They have to go to the market and purchase these things, in addition to luxury goods, right? If they want luxury goods, they have to go and purchase them in Russian stores, at Russian markets. So by the 18th century, that's the 1700s, Russia became one of the great powers of Europe, right? It is now a powerful nation, on par with like England, France, Spain. Power for Russia stemmed from wealth found in the rich agricultural lands that they keep adding and right to their empire as they expand, the valuable furs that they find, and they also find mineral deposits in these new areas. Not really so much gold and silver, but other important minerals, particularly that become important by the late 1700s. We haven't talked about this yet, but in our next unit, we're going to pick up with the Industrial Revolution and minerals that become important for the Industrial Revolution. So iron ore, coal, things like this. To do all this, to build and maintain the Russian Empire, to exert its power and to consolidate its power, Russia becomes a highly militarized state, meaning that there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of resources, there's a lot of time, and a lot of people are expected to be part of the military. The military is an important part. It's celebrated in the culture. And so it has a large army, primarily a standing army. Russia looks and utilizes gunpowder weapons early on, and that is an effective and a technologically advantageous weapon for them to use, particularly against other peoples. The Russian Empire stays intact until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So this is a long-lasting empire. If we say that its beginnings is in the 1400s, right, the mid 1400s, or the late 1400s, excuse me, as we saw on the previous slide, right, and its expansion. This is an empire that lasts about 500 years. Now, notice we call it the Soviet Union because in between 1917 and 1920, it goes through a change in government. It goes from being a monarchy, right, an absolute monarchy. It becomes a democracy very quickly, and then it shifts into communism. But the territory, right, how it operates, the territory it controls, those things all remain. And that's why I'm saying here that it stays intact until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, right? So even through communist Russia or the Soviet Union, as a territory, there's not a lot of change. The way it operates, the way it emphasizes military, although maybe they're not always the best, but the way it emphasizes military is important, and those things remain the same. Just the government itself, the structure of government itself changes, but as an empire, it remains. All right, and that's what I need to emphasize there. There are, of course, a variety of changes even before the communist revolution in Russia that creates the Soviet Union. And there are attempts at democracy, or at least lessening the rule in Russia. But for the most part, right, by the 1600s, there is a strong tradition in Russia of an autocratic government with a powerful monarchy. If we think about in England, the monarchy is losing power and parliament is gaining power during this time. In Russia, there is no There is no parliament to speak of. There is, I mean, a body that at least on the outside looks like a parliament, but they have no real power. All government power rests with the monarch or czar. And so this is an autocratic government, and this is a tradition of that. And so that tradition actually lasts, right? Because even with communist Russia or the Soviet Union, that is still a strong autocratic government with a dictator. But in the 1600s, with a man like Peter the Great, who is a great example of an autocratic ruler, a ruler who believes in the absolute authority and power of himself as the czar, right? There is also a belief that only a strong ruler could hold together such a large empire with such a diverse population, right? If you're going to have all this diversity, you need a strong, strong leader who holds this all together. Democracy is not going to work because no one's going to be able to agree on anything. So you need someone with a clear vision, a clear, strong, powerful voice, and the ability to back it up with that very powerful military that will obey. So Russia is ruled by monarchs, strong monarchs for the most part, until the early 1900s when we go through that revolution, which we'll talk about later. So if we were to compare the Russian Empire with those of other Western European countries, we're going to see a couple interesting things here. First, I've already alluded to this, right? The Russian Empire acquired, right, in the Russian Empire, they acquired their territories that were right next to them. So they just kind of, like a blob, just kind of spread out, right, and added those territories to them. They had been in contact with these for a significant period of time. It's not like they didn't exactly know who these other peoples were, like the nomads. In fact, that's why they took some of made some of the decisions they made, is because they'd had experience with nomads. Or if we compare that with the Western European countries, and here I'm talking about France, Spain, England, a little bit of Portugal, and a little bit of the Netherlands, but those three are the main ones, right? Their empires primarily are based on territories that they acquired far away. So they can't just walk, right, from their capital, like a London. They can't just walk to Jamestown. It's a long ways away. And they didn't know about these areas until about 1492, right, after Columbus sails to America and comes back with a report. So these are brand new cultures to Western European countries who formed their empires based on these territories from far away. Russia, they have some knowledge of them. Another interesting comparison. For the Russian Empire, they acquired the territories at the same time that a Russian state was taking shape. So as this Russian state is developing, right, and as this tradition of a strong monarchy is developing, this is at the same time that they are expanding their territory and creating a Russian empire. For the Western European countries, Spain is already well established, at least the monarchy is, right? England is fairly well established. France is fairly well established. And so they had established themselves as solid European states. They'd fought each other in Europe, right? We've been talking about this. They had been developing their states for a lot longer time, and they were a fairly well established nation state by the time they began to acquire overseas territories to create an overseas empire. So the empire, right, happens after, for the Western European nations, after the state is established, and for Russia it happens at the same time. And lastly, we can think of it this way. Russia was an empire versus the British had an empire. And if we think of it that way, right, again, this basically harkens back to the fact that Russia was a land-based empire, that it was just one big circle drawn on a map, versus British had a whole bunch of possessions, right? They had a whole bunch of little areas that you would circle on the map. And so Britain possessed those, right? It was always British first, and those other territories right? With the exception, well, all of them, because even the Americas, who felt that they were an exception, that they were British, they ended up getting independence, right? So all the other territories were subservients, weren't even considered British citizens. Whereas Russia, these other areas, right, they Russified, they became Russian, as we talked about. And so Russia was an empire, that's part of its identity, whereas the British had possessed an empire. And I hope that made sense there. Okay, let's look at China for just a little bit here. So the main, right, the main empire of China during this period is what we call the Qing or the Manchu dynasty ruling, and therefore the Qing dynasty or the Manchurian dynasty or empire, excuse me, in China. And it rules. It is officially the dynasty of China in 1644. So it is towards the last half of this period that we're talking about. But notice they rule to 1912. So this is a fairly long empire. And they are foreigners. They are invaders from Manchuria, and we can see that Manchuria is up here, right? This is north of Korea and kind of north of Japan, whereas China had always been centered here. This is the center of China and had been, right, for much of our history. We'd had another foreigner, right, from Mongolia rule, but notice they're an outsider. They are not from central China, and this is what we consider to be the core of China. So these are outsiders, and they come, they conquer this area, and they create what we call the Qing Empire. Once they established this part as, right, of China, so they basically, this was the Ming Empire, was what they conquered. And so the Manchurians come down, they conquer the Ming Empire, they make this one large empire, and then they start expanding. They enlarge the size of China, and they look to, right, the north, and they conquer Mongolia. Then they look to the west, at this area, which gets into Tibet, and then this area here, Xinjiang, and they add those areas there. This incorporates, as they expand, like with Russia, incorporates a lot of non-Chinese peoples as they expand north and west. Again, right? Mongolians, not Chinese. The people who live out here in Xinjiang, not Chinese. In fact, these two groups have been long time, right, nomadic opponents, enemies, the foe of China. And in Tibet, again, not Chinese. Now, this somewhat works in the Manchurian Empire because, of course, the rulers are not Chinese. And so there is, at least from the government point of view, there's a little bit more room and it's not as big of a deal. But of course, for the people in central China, core China, this is always kind of an underlying issue. Remember, xenophobia. So, Qing rulers and their cultural elements. So some things that they maintained. Then we're talking about the rulers, and we can see some similarities with the Mongolian rulers, right, when they did this. The Qing rulers kept their ethnic distinctiveness, so they forbade intermarriage between themselves and native Chinese. That's one thing that they did. But they did adopt Chinese language, Confucian teachings, and Chinese government techniques. So they were kind of right, they looked Chinese, they spoke Chinese, except for some things they didn't do. And this kind of kept them separated and created problems for them in the 1900s, which is why their empire falls partly why their empire falls in 1912. So what motivates the Chinese? Well, security concerns, similar to Russia, right? We need to, again, these nomadic peoples like the Mongols and other nomadic tribes to the north and west for China, we need to find a way to control that and secure our interests and prevent them from running free and raiding, etc. So this is a defensive necessity, this expansion. The result of this is that they undertook an 80-year military effort to bring together surrounding regions under Chinese control. This is a long-term project. A lot of war, a lot of fighting, long-term, and ultimately by 1670, somewhat fairly successful. Our last point of discussion here is what was life like in the Chinese Empire and the Qing under Qing rulers? Well, it was generally good. The Qing showed respect for other cultures. They did not force people to assimilate to Chinese culture. Chinese settlers. So before I get to the Chinese settlers, so in general, they were tolerant of other cultures, including Europeans, and this is what gets them in trouble by the 20th century, the 1900s, is native Chinese feel that they had been too open to Europeans. The other thing that happens is that Chinese settlers did not flood the other regions of the empire. So this remains, right, a distinctly native Chinese region, and then a distinctly native Manchurian region, and a distinctly native Mongolian region, etc. Unlike with Russia, right, with Russian settlers and farmers flooding into Siberia, right, so that by the 1720s, the population is about 70% Russian, only 30% native Siberian. This does not happen in the Chinese Empire. Native Chinese stay in central China, right? And these other parts of the empire are just kind of tacked on. So in this sense, the Chinese Empire is more similar to a place like England, which is tacked on, right, by the 1700s, which we haven't talked as much about yet. But by then, they have added, for instance, India. But British settlers don't flood India and settle India, right? It's just, Britain, London, just rules India, and they collect taxes and so on. And so this would be, right, so if we were to think about one more comparison, right, Russia. The Russian experience with settlers flooding into Siberia is similar, not exactly the same, but it's a little bit more similar to Spain, with Spanish settlers flooding into the Americas. Whereas the Chinese are probably more similar to England in this particular respect. All right, that is it for today. So there'll be a few questions for you to answer as we wrap this up. Just make sure you got some of the big ideas here, and we will see you next time.